Welcome to History Secret Wars, the channel where we decode the classified files of the past to understand the manipulations of the present. We are not interested in the official narrative of freedom versus tyranny. We are interested in the mechanics of power, the levers pulled in the shadows. Today, we are investigating the most successful influence operation in human history. You have been taught that America entered World War I to make the world safe for democracy. You have been told it was a moral crusade against German aggression. But what if I told you that the decision to go to war was not made in the White House in 1917? What if I told you it was effectively decided within 6 hours of the war, starting in 1914, by a ship dragging a hook across the bottom of the North Sea? This is the story of the cable cutters. It is the story of how the British Empire, realizing it could not defeat Germany alone, decided to weaponize information to hijack the industrial might of the United States. It wasn't a war of bullets. It was a war of bandwidth. And the first shot was silent. The date is August 4th, 1914. The deadline for the British ultimatum to Germany has just expired. The Great War has officially begun. While the armies of Europe are mobilizing millions of men, marching towards the frontiers of France and Belgium with brass bands playing, a single British ship is slipping out of the harbor into the mist of the North Sea. It is the CS Alert, often referred to in lore as the Telconia, a cable-laying vessel. Its mission is top secret. It is not carrying guns. It is carrying grappling hooks and shears. Its target? The transatlantic cables. In 1914, the world was connected by a web of undersea telegraph cables. These were the internet of the Edwardian age. They carried the stock prices, the diplomatic messages, the news reports, and the private letters of the world. Information moved at the speed of electricity. Germany had invested millions in laying 5 massive cables across the Atlantic, connecting Emden in Germany to the Americas and Africa. This was their voice. This was their link to the neutral world, especially to the United States. The British Admiralty knew that in a modern war, controlling the narrative is just as important as controlling the sea lanes. If Germany could talk to America, Germany could explain its side of the story. Germany could negotiate loans. Germany could buy sympathy. So, the British decided to gag them. In the freezing, choppy waters off the German coast, the British ship lowered its hooks. They dragged the seabed until they snagged the thick, gutta-percha-covered cables. They hauled the dripping black lines up to the deck. The crew didn't just cut them. That would be too easy to repair. They used axes to chop out massive sections of the cable. Then, they dragged the loose ends miles apart and dropped them back into the abyss. Within hours, Germany was deaf and mute. Imagine if, today, a country cut the fiber optic cables connecting its enemy to the internet. That is exactly what happened. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, woke up the next morning to find that his direct line to Washington, to New York, to the world, was dead. From that moment on, almost every piece of news, every battlefield report, every description of the war that reached the American public had to pass through London. It had to pass through the British cable system. And that meant it had to pass through the British censor. The cable cutters had achieved a monopoly on truth. They had built a filter between the war in Europe and the minds of the American people. The Germans could still communicate, but only via wireless radio, which the British could listen to, or by using the cables of neutral countries, which also passed through London. This was the first act of the secret war. Britain knew that the United States was a sleeping giant. The British Empire needed American steel, American food, and eventually, American blood. By cutting the cables, they ensured that the giant would only hear what Britain wanted it to hear. But cutting the line was only the first step. Once you have silenced your enemy, you must fill the silence with your own voice. The British were about to launch the greatest propaganda campaign the world had ever seen. But silence can be deafening, and the Germans were not about to go down quietly. Next, we uncovered the monopoly of truth and how a secret bureau in London began to rewrite reality for the American breakfast table. With the German cables lying severed at the bottom of the North Sea, a vacuum was created. And in the world of intelligence, a vacuum is an opportunity. The British government moved instantly to fill it. They established the War Propaganda Bureau, but they didn't put it in a government building where journalists could find it. They hid it in the offices of a private insurance company at Wellington House, Buckingham Gate. This wasn't a military operation run by generals. It was a psychological operation run by intellectuals. The man in charge was Charles Masterman, a brilliant liberal politician. He understood that Americans were suspicious of propaganda. If they thought the British government was trying to manipulate them, they would recoil. So, Masterman's strategy was the invisible ink. The propaganda would not look like propaganda. It would look like literature. It would look like news. It would look like the honest opinion of independent observers. Masterman convened a secret meeting. He didn't invite soldiers. He invited authors. The giants of British literature sat around the table at Wellington House. H.G. Wells, Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, Rudyard Kipling, and Thomas Hardy. He gave them a simple mission. Write. Write about the war. Write about the justice of our cause. But do not make it sound official. Write as yourselves. These authors were famous in America. Their books were on the shelves of every educated family from Boston to San Francisco. When H.G. Wells wrote an article about the war to end war, Americans believed it because they trusted H.G. Wells. They didn't know he was effectively working for British intelligence. Wellington House became a factory of narratives. They produced pamphlets, books, and newsletters. They didn't sell them. They mailed them directly to American influencers. They targeted pastors, university professors, local newspaper editors, and politicians. The genius of the operation was the neutrality of the content. They didn't just scream, "Germany is evil." They used subtle, persuasive arguments about international law, the rights of small nations, like Belgium, and the defense of civilization. Meanwhile, the American press was starving for news. With the German cables cut, the American correspondents in Europe had to rely on the British censor for access to the front. The British military gave them access, but only to their side of the story. The American newspapers, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, began to print reports that were essentially British press releases. They had no other source. If a battle happened, the British version arrived in New York hours before the German version, which had to be routed via circuitous wireless relays. By the time the German denial arrived, the ink was already dry on the morning edition. The British story was the truth. The German story was just a claim. This monopoly allowed Britain to shape the first impression. And in psychology, the first impression is the hardest to break. Germany tried to fight back. They sent agents to New York. They bought newspapers. But their propaganda was clumsy. It was heavy-handed, arrogant, and clearly German. It lacked the subtle, gentlemanly touch of Wellington House. The British were playing 3D chess. They weren't asking America to join the war. Not yet. That would be too pushy. They were simply defining the good guys and the bad guys. They were preparing the soil. But stories and pamphlets were not enough to drag a pacifist nation into hell. They needed something visceral. They needed blood. They needed a villain so cartoonishly evil that no American could remain neutral. And so, they invented the Hun. But ink on a page can only do so much. To move a nation, you need to curdle its blood. Next, we open the factory of lies and expose the manufacturing of the rape of Belgium, where facts were twisted into nightmares to horrify the American public. The German invasion of Belgium in August 1914 was a violation of international law. It was brutal. Civilians were executed. Cities like Leuven were burned. This is historical fact. But for Wellington House, the facts were not enough. They needed monsters. The British propaganda machine seized upon the suffering of Belgium and turned it into a horror movie. They realized that Americans, safe across the ocean, didn't care about the balance of power in Europe. But they cared about babies. They cared about nuns. They cared about innocent women. So, the stories began to change. The reports filtering through the British cables to New York didn't just speak of executions. They spoke of German soldiers bayoneting babies. They spoke of nuns being tied to the bells of church towers and wrung to death. They spoke of German officers cutting off the hands of Belgian children so they could never hold a rifle. Were these true? After the war, extensive investigations found almost zero evidence for the most gruesome stories. The handless children were never found. The bayoneted babies were myths. But in 1914, these stories were dynamite. To legitimize these rumors, the British played their MasterCard. They appointed a man with an impeccable reputation for honesty to investigate, Lord Bryce. He was a former ambassador to the U.S., a man loved and trusted by Americans. The Bryce Report, released in 1915, was a bombshell. It was a catalog of depravity. It presented anonymous depositions, mostly from refugees who had heard rumors from other refugees, as hard evidence. Because Lord Bryce's name was on the cover, America believed it. The New York Times published the report in full. It became a bestseller. The impact was seismic. Germany was no longer just a rival nation. It was a criminal enterprise. The Kaiser was depicted in cartoons as a beast, a Hun with blood dripping from his hands, eyeing the pure, innocent women of civilization. This was the othering of the enemy. It made it impossible for Americans to see Germans as human beings. It made neutrality feel like complicity. The Germans, with their cables cut, were screaming into the void. They invited American journalists to the front to see that they weren't eating babies. But the damage was done. The image of the Beast of Berlin was burned into the American psyche. This propaganda campaign served a dual purpose. First, it inflamed public opinion. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it smoothed the way for the real engine of the war: finance. You see, while the American public was reading about Belgian babies, the American bankers were looking at their ledgers. They wanted to lend money to the Allies. But lending money to a belligerent was risky. Lending money to the defender of civilization against a child-murdering monster? That was a moral duty. The lies about Belgium greased the wheels of Wall Street. The British knew that once the American economy was hooked on the war, the American army would eventually have to follow to protect the investment. But while the public was fed nightmares, the bankers were fed gold. Next, we enter the boardroom of J.P. Morgan to reveal the golden handcuffs, how the British Empire bought the American economy on credit, ensuring that a British defeat would mean an American depression. While the poets at Wellington House were winning the battle for the American heart, a different group of men in London were busy capturing the American wallet. War is expensive. In 1914, Britain was the richest nation on earth, but the scale of the conflict was burning through their gold reserves at a terrifying rate. By 1915, Britain and France were running out of cash to buy the shells, the wheat, and the steel they needed to fight. There was only one place left to get it: the United States. The British government sent a secret commission to New York to meet with the king of American finance, J.P. Morgan Jr. The deal they struck was unprecedented. J.P. Morgan and Company became the sole purchasing agent for the British Empire in the United States. If the British Army needed 10,000 horses, they asked Morgan. If they needed 1,000,000 rifles, Morgan found the supplier. And who paid for it? Morgan did. Or rather, Morgan organized the loans. Wall Street began to issue massive war bonds for Britain and France. Billions of dollars, in today's money, trillions, flowed from American banks to the Allied war effort. This money didn't leave America. It was used to pay American factories, DuPont, U.S. Steel, Remington, to build the weapons for the Allies. The American economy exploded. The Depression of 1913 vanished. Farmers were rich. Factory workers had overtime. America was getting fat on the war. But there was a catch. A deadly catch. By 1916, the exposure of American banks to the Allied cause was so massive that American neutrality became a financial impossibility. If Germany won the war, Britain and France would default. If they defaulted, J.P. Morgan would collapse. If Morgan collapsed, the entire U.S. banking system would implode. The U.S. economy would enter a depression worse than anything in history. The cable cutters had forged golden handcuffs. They had inextricably linked the prosperity of the American citizen to the victory of the British Empire. Germany knew this. They watched as American ships, technically neutral but loaded with ammo bought with Morgan's money, sailed to England. They realized that America was not neutral. America was the arsenal of the enemy. This put the Germans in a strategic bind. They had submarines, U-boats. They could sink these ships, but if they sank American ships, they risked bringing the U.S. military into the war. It was a trap. If Germany did nothing, the American supplies would strangle them. If Germany attacked the supply line, the American army would attack them. The British knew this. In fact, they counted on it. They knew that sooner or later, a German U-boat commander would make a mistake. Or, perhaps, he wouldn't even need to make a mistake. Perhaps a target could be placed in his crosshairs that was too tempting to resist. A target filled with civilians, but also filled with secrets. The ledger was balanced, but the debt had to be paid in blood. Next, we set sail on the Floating Fuse, the tragedy of the RMS Lusitania, and the dark question of whether the British Admiralty used 1,200 passengers as bait to hook the American president. May 7th, 1915. The coast of Ireland. The RMS Lusitania, the pride of the Cunard Line, the fastest and most luxurious ocean liner in the world, is steaming towards Liverpool. On board are nearly 2,000 passengers, including 128 Americans. They are drinking tea, playing cards, and looking out at the calm sea. They believe they are safe. After all, there are rules in war. You don't sink passenger ships without warning. But waiting beneath the waves is U-20, a German submarine commanded by Walter Schwieger. He sees the massive ship in his periscope. He fires a single torpedo. The explosion is massive. But then, a second explosion rips the ship apart from the inside. The Lusitania sinks in just 18 minutes. 1,198 people die. The reaction in America is volcanic. The British propaganda machine goes into overdrive. Murder on the high seas. Savages. The images of drowned American bodies wash away any lingering doubts about the evil Huns. But let us look at the secret war angle. Why was the Lusitania there? Why was she sailing alone, without a destroyer escort, in a known U-boat zone? Why did the British Admiralty recall the cruiser Juno, which was supposed to protect her? Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had written in a secret letter before the tragedy, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany." The British knew the U-20 was in the area. Room 40. The code breakers we will meet soon had intercepted the German signals. They knew the danger. They didn't warn the Lusitania. And the second explosion? The Germans claimed the Lusitania was carrying munitions. The British denied it furiously, calling it a monstrous lie. History has opened the cargo manifest. The Germans were right. The Lusitania was carrying 4 million rounds of rifle ammunition and tons of shell casings. She was a legitimate military target hiding behind human shields. The British used the Lusitania as a floating fuse. They gambled that if the Germans sank her, the outrage would bring America into the war. It almost worked. The American public screamed for war. But President Woodrow Wilson hesitated. He was a stubborn man who had won the election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He demanded an apology from Germany, but he didn't declare war. The British were frustrated. The bait had been taken. The blood had been spilled, but the fish hadn't been hooked. They needed something more. They needed to bring the war not just to American ships, but to American soil. And the Germans, in their clumsiness, were about to help them do exactly that. The ship sank, but the president didn't blink. The war had to come closer. Next, we witnessed terror at home. The massive explosion in New York Harbor that woke up a nation as German saboteurs brought the battlefield to the Statue of Liberty's feet. July 30th, 1916. Jersey City, New York Harbor. It is 2 a.m. The city that never sleeps is quiet. In the shadow of the Statue of Liberty lies Black Tom Island. It is a major munitions depot. Warehouses are packed with 2 million pounds of explosives and ammunition waiting to be shipped to the British Army in France. Suddenly, a series of small fires break out. The guards flee. Then, the explosion hits. It was one of the largest artificial non-nuclear explosions in history. The shockwave was felt in Philadelphia. Windows were shattered in Times Square. Shrapnel scarred the arm of the Statue of Liberty, which is why you still can't go up into the torch today. To the average American, it was a tragic accident. Or maybe a mystery. But to the intelligence agencies, it was an act of war. German agents, realizing they couldn't stop the American supplies from reaching Britain by sea, had decided to blow them up at the source. This was the work of a German sabotage ring operating inside the United States, led by the spy master Franz von Papen, who operated under diplomatic cover. The Black Tom explosion was the 9/11 of 1916. It brought the reality of the war to the American doorstep. It showed that the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a shield. The British intelligence services, who were monitoring the German spies, likely knew about the sabotage networks. Did they stop them? Or did they let the Germans hang themselves? Every time a German agent planted a bomb in a factory or a ship, the British made sure the American press knew about it. They fed the narrative. German spies are everywhere. Your neighbor might be a spy. Paranoia swept the U.S. The hyphenated Americans, German Americans, were looked at with suspicion. The cultural ties that bound America to Germany, the beer halls, the newspapers, the societies, began to fray. But even this wasn't enough for Wilson. He still held on to neutrality. He needed a smoking gun, a piece of evidence so undeniable, so treacherous, that it would leave him no choice. And deep in the bowels of the old Admiralty building in London, a group of eccentric geniuses were about to find it. The bombs shook the windows, but they didn't shatter the neutrality. We meet the codebreakers who were reading the Kaiser's mind, waiting for the one mistake that would change the world. While the soldiers were dying in the mud of the Somme, the decisive battle of the war was happening in a dusty, smoke-filled room in London. Room 40. This was the headquarters of British Naval Intelligence's code-breaking unit. It was run by Admiral Blinker Hall. He was a man with a twitching eye, hence the nickname, and a mind like a steel trap. Remember the first part of our story? The British had cut the German cables. This forced the Germans to use wireless radio and the cables of neutral countries, like Sweden and the US, to send their diplomatic messages. What the Germans didn't know was that the British had tapped everything. Every wireless signal sent from Berlin was plucked out of the air by listening stations in England. Every telegram sent through the transatlantic cables, even the American ones, passed through a relay station in Cornwall, where the British copied them before sending them on. Room 40 was reading the Kaiser's mail. They had captured German code books from sunken U-boats. They had cracked the diplomatic ciphers. Admiral Hall sat in his office like a spider in the center of a web. He knew more about German intentions than the German generals did. But intelligence is a dangerous asset. If you use it, you reveal that you have it. If Hall told the Americans, "We know what the Germans are saying," the Germans would change their codes, and Room 40 would go blind. So Hall sat on secrets. He let ships sink. He let battles happen. He was waiting for the golden bullet, a message that was worth blowing his cover for. In January 1917, the teleprinter in Room 40 began to chatter. A message was coming in from Berlin. It was encoded in 0075, the top-secret diplomatic code used for the German Foreign Office. It was addressed to the German ambassador in Mexico City. The codebreakers got to work. As the German words emerged from the numbers, their jaws dropped. They weren't looking at a routine diplomatic note. They were looking at a proposal for an invasion of the United States. It was the Zimmermann telegram. The spider had caught the ultimate fly. But how do you use it without getting caught yourself? Next, we reveal the smoking gun, the contents of the telegram that promised to carve up America, and the brilliant, cynical game Admiral Hall played to deliver it to Washington. Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary, had made a fatal miscalculation. Desperate to break the British blockade, Germany had decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking every ship approaching Britain, including American ones. They knew this would bring the US into the war. So, Zimmermann needed a distraction. He needed to keep the American army busy at home so they couldn't come to Europe. His plan? Alliance with Mexico. The telegram read, "We make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. Make war together, make peace together, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona." He was offering 3 American states to Mexico if they attacked the US. When Admiral Hall read this in Room 40, he knew he had won the war. But he had a problem. A massive problem. The telegram had been sent via a specific route, the American diplomatic cable. The Germans had persuaded the US to let them use their cable for peace proposals. If Hall revealed he had the telegram, he would have to admit that Britain was spying on the American president's private communications. Wilson would be furious. Instead of declaring war on Germany, he might turn on Britain for violating US privacy. Hall had to launder the intelligence. He waited. He knew the telegram had to be forwarded from Washington to Mexico City via Western Union. He sent an agent to the telegraph office in Mexico City to bribe a clerk and get a copy of the received version. This way, he could claim, "We didn't spy on you, Mr. President. We intercepted this in Mexico. It was a masterclass in spycraft." Hall held on to the telegram for weeks. He waited for the tension to build. He waited until the Germans started sinking American ships again. Then, on February 24th, 1917, he handed the decoded telegram to the American ambassador in London. The shock was absolute. When Wilson read it, his face went pale. The Hun wasn't just killing civilians in Europe, he was plotting to give Texas back to Mexico. The fuse was lit. The bomb was under the White House. Next, we witnessed the trap snaps shut, the release of the telegram, the explosion of American rage, and the end of the long hesitation. On March 1st, 1917, the text of the Zimmermann telegram was splashed across the front pages of every newspaper in America. The reaction was not just anger, it was disbelief. It was so audacious, so cartoonishly evil, that many Americans thought it was British propaganda. The Hearst newspapers, which were anti-British, screamed fake. They claimed it was a forgery created by the perfidious Albion, Britain, to trick America. For 2 days, the issue hung in the balance. Was it real? Or was it another lie from the factory at Wellington House? Then, Arthur Zimmermann did something incredibly stupid, or perhaps incredibly honest. A reporter asked him in Berlin, "Is the telegram real?" He admitted it. He thought he could explain it away as a defensive measure. But he underestimated the American cowboy spirit. You don't threaten to give Texas away. The admission destroyed the anti-war movement overnight. The pacifists went silent. The Midwesterners, who didn't care about ships in the Atlantic, certainly cared about a Mexican invasion on the southern border. The cable cutters had succeeded. They had shaped the narrative, blocked the enemy's voice, financed the war through Wall Street, and finally delivered the smoking gun that made neutrality impossible. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress. He asked for a declaration of war. He used the language that Wellington House had been feeding him for 3 years. The world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, America was at war. The industrial might of the United States, the factories, the oil, the manpower, was now fully committed to the Allied cause. Germany was doomed. The steel trap of the British blockade was now reinforced by the American hammer. Admiral Hall sat in room 40 and smiled. The pen had defeated the sword. The guns have stopped, but the signal is still transmitting. In our final dossier, we examine the legacy, how the techniques invented by the cable cutters created the modern world of information warfare, fake news, and the deep state. The First World War ended in 1918, but the war for your mind never ended. It just got an upgrade. The cable cutters of 1914 taught the world a lesson that every superpower has memorized. He who controls the narrative controls the war. Wellington House didn't shut down. It evolved. The techniques of invisible propaganda, invented by Masterman and H.G. Wells, became the foundation of the public relations industry. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the father of PR, worked for the U.S. Propaganda Bureau during the war. He took the British techniques and applied them to selling cigarettes, cars, and presidents. Room 40 became the GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters. The partnership between British and American intelligence forged in 1917 eventually became the Five Eyes Alliance, the global surveillance network that listens to the world today. The golden handcuffs of Wall Street set the precedent for the military-industrial complex. The idea that war is good for business became a cornerstone of the American economy. And the act of cutting the cables? Look at the modern world. We worry about cyber attacks on undersea internet cables. We worry about nations banning social media platforms. We worry about fake news and foreign election interference. It's the same war, only the technology has changed. In 1914, Britain cut the copper wires to isolate Germany. Today, nations build firewalls to isolate their people. The story of how Britain dragged America into World War I is not a conspiracy theory. It is a masterclass in statecraft. It shows us that there is no such thing as neutrality in a connected world. If you are reading the news, you are on the battlefield. Thank you for watching History Secret Wars. We hope this series has cut through the static of official history. If you want to know who is cutting the cables today, make sure you subscribe. Ring the bell, because the next signal you hear might be the one they want you to hear. This is History Secret Wars. Trust nothing. Verify everything.